The morning sun barely touched the Montana horizon when Jake Morrison heard the crying. It wasn't the usual sound of cattle or the wind through the pines. This was different. Human. Desperate. As he rode his horse through the remote section of his ranch, following a fence line he hadn't checked in months, the sound grew stronger. What he discovered in that abandoned cabin would challenge everything he thought he knew about family, sacrifice, and the power of human kindness. Sarah Mitchell sat in the corner of the dilapidated structure, her clothes torn and dirty, blood seeping through a makeshift bandage on her leg. Around her, 7 children huddled together, ranging from a toddler barely walking to a teenager trying to be brave. They had been running for 3 days, with nowhere left to go and no one left to trust. When Jake's shadow filled the doorway, Sarah didn't know if their nightmare was about to end or if it had just gotten worse. But sometimes, when the world seems darkest, ordinary people make extraordinary choices that ripple through generations. This is the story of how one rancher's decision on a cold Montana morning changed not just 8 lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to be family. Jake Morrison had been working his ranch for 37 years, ever since his father passed, and left him the sprawling property that stretched across the Montana wilderness. He knew every creek, every hill, and every hidden corner of the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. That Tuesday morning in October started like any other, with coffee before dawn and plans to check the far fence line where cattle sometimes wandered through broken posts. His horse, Thunder, picked carefully through the rocky terrain as morning mist clung to the valley floor. Jake had always found peace in these early rides, when the world belonged only to him and the wildlife that called the ranch home. The silence was broken only by the steady rhythm of Thunder's hooves and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. As they approached the old line shack, a cabin built by his grandfather decades ago and rarely used except during harsh winters, Jake noticed something was wrong. The door hung open, and there were footprints in the dirt around the entrance. His first thought was trespassers, maybe hikers who had gotten lost and sought shelter. It wouldn't be the first time, but as he dismounted and approached the cabin, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Soft crying, barely audible, coming from inside. Then, a woman's voice, hushed and urgent, trying to comfort someone. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the rifle on his saddle, not out of aggression but from years of caution in the wilderness where danger could come in many forms. He called out before entering, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with his share of difficult situations. "Hello? Anyone in there? This is private property." The crying stopped immediately, replaced by a tense silence that seemed to stretch forever. When Jake stepped into the doorway, nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. A woman, probably in her 30s, sat pressed against the far wall with her arms wrapped around a small child. Her face was pale and drawn with exhaustion, and he could see dried blood on her clothes. Around her, 6 other children of various ages huddled together like frightened animals. The oldest looked to be about 15, a boy with protective eyes who had positioned himself between Jake and the younger ones. The youngest couldn't have been more than 2, clinging to the woman with tiny fists. Between them were children who looked like stair steps, each one bearing the unmistakable signs of fear and exhaustion. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just needed somewhere safe to rest." Her eyes never left Jake's face, searching for any sign of what kind of man she was dealing with. Jake slowly removed his hat, a gesture his father had taught him was the first sign of respect when meeting someone new. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" He kept his voice gentle, recognizing the terror in her eyes and the protective way she held the children. The woman's name was Sarah Mitchell, though Jake wouldn't learn that for several more hours. What he could see immediately was that she was injured, malnourished, and completely exhausted. The children showed signs of having been on the road for days, their clothes dirty and their faces gaunt with hunger. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, taking a careful step closer. "This is my land, but right now that's not important. What's important is getting you and these children somewhere warm and safe. Can you walk?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears at the kindness in his voice. She had expected anger, demands to leave, possibly even threats. Instead, this stranger was offering help to people he had every right to consider trespassers. The 15-year-old boy spoke up for the first time, his voice trying to sound braver than his years. She hurt her leg pretty bad yesterday. We've been carrying the little ones most of the way. Jake could see the exhaustion in the teenager's face, the weight of responsibility that no child should have to carry. Without hesitation, Jake walked back to his horse and retrieved a first aid kit from his saddlebags. He also pulled out a thermos of coffee and some energy bars he always carried on long rides. As he returned to the cabin, he was already making mental calculations about how to get 8 people back to his house safely. "What I'm going to do," Jake explained as he knelt beside Sarah to examine her injured leg, "is take you all back to my house. We'll get you cleaned up, fed, and that leg looked at properly. After that, we can figure out what comes next." Sarah grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic. "You don't understand," she whispered urgently. "We can't just go anywhere. There are people looking for us. Bad people." Jake paused in his examination of her wound, meeting her eyes directly. "Ma'am, I don't know what you're running from. And right now I don't need to know. What I do know is that you and these children are hurt, hungry, and scared. Whatever's chasing you will have to go through me to get to you." The simple statement carried such conviction that even the children seemed to relax slightly. Jake had dealt with his share of trouble over the years, from cattle thieves to dangerous wildlife to the occasional criminal who thought the remote ranch would make a good hiding place. He had never lost a fight he needed to win. As Jake cleaned and bandaged Sarah's leg wound, she began to tell him pieces of their story. She had been married to a man who seemed loving at first, but gradually revealed himself to be controlling and violent. The children weren't all hers biologically, but she had taken them in over the years as their situations became desperate. Her husband had connections that made simply calling the police impossible, people who would ensure that any official complaints disappeared and that Sarah and the children would face severe consequences for trying to leave. The breaking point had come 3 nights ago when her husband had threatened to seriously hurt one of the younger children as punishment for Sarah's perceived disobedience. She had grabbed what little money she could find, packed basic supplies, and fled in the middle of the night with all 7 children. They had been walking and hitchhiking ever since, staying off main roads and avoiding populated areas where they might be spotted. Jake listened without judgment, his experienced hands gentle as he worked on her injury. He had heard enough stories over the years to know that the truth was often more complicated and more dangerous than it appeared on the surface. What mattered to him was the evidence in front of his eyes. 8 people who needed help and had nowhere else to turn. The logistics of getting everyone back to his house safely were complicated by the fact that Sarah could barely walk, and several of the children were too exhausted to make the trek on foot. Jake made the decision to ride back alone first, returning with his truck and enough supplies to make the journey comfortable. "I'm going to leave you my rifle," he told the teenager, whose name he learned was Marcus. "Do you know how to use one?" When Marcus nodded, Jake showed him how to operate the safety and where to keep it positioned for quick access. "Anyone comes near this cabin who isn't me, you make noise. Fire a warning shot in the air. These mountains carry sound for miles, and I'll hear it." As Jake prepared to leave, the youngest child, a little girl named Emma, reached out to him with small arms. Without thinking, he scooped her up for a moment, feeling her tiny heartbeat against his chest. She whispered something he couldn't quite understand, but the trust in her gesture nearly broke his heart. "I'll be back within 2 hours, he promised Sarah. "Maybe sooner if thunder and I push hard. You have my word." The ride back to his house was the longest Jake could remember, every minute stretching as he worried about the family he had left behind. He had been living alone since his wife died 5 years earlier, the big farmhouse echoing with memories and silence. The idea of filling it with voices and laughter again, even temporarily, stirred something in him that had been dormant for too long. Jake's nearest neighbor was almost 10 miles away, and the closest town was nearly 30 minutes by car. His ranch sat in a valley that provided natural privacy and protection, surrounded by mountains and accessible only by a single road that he could easily monitor. If Sarah and the children were truly running from dangerous people, This was probably one of the safest places in Montana for them to be. As he loaded supplies into his truck, Jake found himself thinking about his late wife, Maria, and how she would have responded to this situation. Maria had always had room in her heart for strays, whether they were animals or people who needed a second chance. She would have already been planning sleeping arrangements and thinking about what clothes might fit the children. The drive back to the cabin seemed to take forever, even though Jake knew exactly how long the rough road should take. When he finally reached the line shack, he was relieved to find everyone exactly as he had left them. Marcus was positioned by the window with the rifle, alert and responsible beyond his years. Getting everyone loaded into the truck required careful planning. Sarah needed help walking, and the younger children were nervous about getting into a vehicle with someone they had just met. Jake took his time, letting each child examine the truck and ask questions, building trust one small interaction at a time. The drive to the main house was quiet except for the youngest children pointing out horses and cattle through the windows. Jake could see Sarah watching the landscape, probably memorizing landmarks and escape routes in case their sanctuary turned out to be another trap. He didn't take offense at her caution. In her situation, he would have been doing exactly the same thing. As they pulled up to the two-story farmhouse with its wraparound porch and flower beds that Maria had planted years ago, Jake could see the children's eyes widen with something that might have been hope. The house was large enough to accommodate everyone comfortably, with bedrooms that had been empty for too long and a kitchen designed to feed a family. "Welcome to Morrison Ranch," Jake said simply as he helped Sarah from the truck. "For as long as you need it, this is your home." Those words would prove to be more prophetic than anyone could have imagined, setting in motion a series of events that would transform not just 8 lives, but an entire community's understanding of what family really means. As Jake unlocked the front door and ushered his unexpected guests inside, none of them could have predicted that this moment of desperate need would become the foundation for something extraordinary. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that had been dark for too long, illuminating faces that carried both fear and hope in equal measure. In the kitchen, Jake began pulling together a meal from whatever he had available, while the children explored their new surroundings with the careful steps of people who had learned not to take safety for granted. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and emotion. She watched Jake move around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, this stranger who had appeared in their darkest hour like something from a fairy tale. But Sarah had learned the hard way that fairy tales often had dark endings, and she couldn't allow herself to believe in this one just yet. Still, for the first time in days, the children were warm and safe. There was food being prepared and beds waiting upstairs. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight they could rest without fear. And sometimes, that's how the most important changes begin, not with grand gestures or dramatic moments, but with simple kindness offered when it's needed most. The first week at Morrison Ranch passed in a delicate dance of establishing routines while respecting boundaries. Jake had converted his home office into a bedroom for Sarah and the 2 youngest children, Emma and 4-year-old Danny. The older children were divided between the guest room and what had been Maria's sewing room, spaces that Jake had avoided for years but now filled with young voices and the sound of footsteps on wooden floors. Sarah remained cautious, always watching, always ready to run. She positioned herself where she could see all exits and kept a bag packed with essentials for herself and the children. Jake understood her vigilance. Trust, once broken as thoroughly as hers had been, couldn't be rebuilt overnight. He gave her space while making sure she knew help was available whenever she was ready to accept it. The children adapted more quickly, as children often do. Marcus, the 15-year-old, appointed himself as protector and helper, shadowing Jake during morning chores and learning the rhythms of ranch life. 10-year-old Lisa became the organizer, making sure younger siblings had clean clothes and ate their meals. 8-year-old twins Michael and Matthew found endless entertainment in the barn cats and the aging border collie, Rex, who seemed delighted to have children to watch over again. 6-year-old Sophie was the artist of the group, finding paper and pencils to create drawings that she left around the house like small gifts. Her pictures showed families of stick figures standing in front of houses, always with the sun shining and flowers blooming nearby. Jake found himself saving every single one. The two youngest, Danny and Emma, gravitated toward Jake with the fearless affection of children too young to fully understand why they had been afraid. Danny followed him around, asking endless questions about horses and cows, while Emma would climb onto his lap whenever he sat down, content just to be close to someone who felt safe. Getting the children enrolled in the local school became Jake's first major challenge. The closest elementary and high school were in Bear Creek, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Sarah panicked at the suggestion, terrified that official records would lead her husband straight to them. "He has people everywhere," she explained during one of their late-night conversations in the kitchen after the children had gone to bed. "Government workers, police officers, people in schools. He always said that if I ever tried to leave, he would find us no matter where we went." Jake set down his coffee mug and looked at her seriously. "Sarah, those children need an education, and they need to be around other kids their own age. We can't keep them hidden forever." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What kind of man are we talking about here? What exactly did he do for work?" For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Sarah told Jake the full truth about her husband, David Mitchell. He was a successful businessman on the surface, owning several legitimate companies that provided cover for his real activities. David was involved in money laundering, drug trafficking, and had connections to organized crime that stretched across multiple states. His legitimate businesses gave him access to politicians, law enforcement, and community leaders who either worked for him willingly or were compromised through blackmail or threats. Sarah herself had been a teacher before her marriage, with a degree in elementary education and years of experience working with children from difficult backgrounds. When David's behavior became increasingly controlling, she had found herself isolated from friends and family, completely dependent on him financially and emotionally. The other children had come into their lives one by one. Kids from Sarah's extended family or children of David's associates who needed somewhere to go when their own families fell apart or disappeared. "I became their mother because no one else would," Sarah explained, tears streaming down her face. "And I stayed with David because I knew he would hurt them if I tried to leave. He made that very clear." Jake listened to her story with growing anger, not at Sarah but at the man who had created this situation. He had dealt with bullies before, both human and animal, and recognized the pattern of control and intimidation that David had used to trap Sarah and the children. The next morning, Jake made some phone calls to people he trusted in the community. Bear Creek was the kind of place where favors were remembered and good people looked out for each other. Within a few days, he had arranged for a private tutor to come to the ranch 3 days a week, officially hired as an educational consultant for ranch children being homeschooled due to family circumstances. Margaret Walsh was a retired teacher in her 60s who had spent 40 years educating children in rural Montana. She arrived at Morrison Ranch with boxes of books, educational supplies, and the kind of patient wisdom that comes from decades of helping children learn and grow. More importantly, she asked no questions about why these particular children needed private education, accepting Jake's simple explanation that it was a temporary arrangement for a family in transition. The transformation in the children when regular lessons began was remarkable. Marcus, who had been carrying the weight of adult responsibilities for years, rediscovered his love of reading and showed a particular aptitude for mathematics. Lisa revealed herself to be a natural leader and excellent student who helped the younger children with their work. The twins, who had been quiet and withdrawn, began to open up through creative writing exercises that allowed them to process their experiences safely. Sophie continued her artwork, but her drawings began to include more details and show more confidence in the safety of her surroundings. Danny and Emma, despite their young ages, showed eagerness to learn that spoke to their resilience and hope for the future. Jake found himself settling into a routine he had never expected, but that felt surprisingly natural. Mornings began with ranch chores, now shared with Marcus and sometimes the older girls. After breakfast, the children would gather in the living room for lessons with Margaret, while Jake worked on ranch business or made trips to town for supplies. Evenings were family time, something Jake hadn't experienced in years. There were homework sessions at the kitchen table, games of cards or board games, and stories read aloud by the fireplace. The house that had been silent for so long now rang with laughter, arguments, and all the chaotic noise of a large family. Sarah gradually began to relax, though she never completely let down her guard. She started helping with household tasks, cooking meals that filled the house with wonderful smells, and bringing organization to spaces that had been neglected for too long. Jake could see glimpses of the teacher she had been, the nurturing woman who had sacrificed everything to protect children who weren't even her own. The first real test of their security came 3 weeks after they arrived. Jake was in the barn when Rex began barking with unusual intensity, the kind of alert that indicated strangers approaching the property. Through the barn window, Jake could see a dark sedan making its way up the ranch road, moving slowly and deliberately. Jake's heart raced as he considered the possibilities. He grabbed his rifle and positioned himself where he could see both the approaching vehicle and the house, ready to signal Sarah if they needed to implement the emergency plan they had discussed but hoped never to use. The car pulled up near the house, and 2 men in business suits got out. They looked completely out of place in the rural setting, their city clothes and polished shoes marking them as outsiders. Jake approached them with apparent casualness, his rifle held low but ready. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Jake asked, his voice friendly but carrying an undertone that suggested they shouldn't assume they were welcome. The men introduced themselves as investigators working for an insurance company, following up on a fraud case involving a missing person and stolen vehicle. They showed Jake photographs that he recognized immediately as Sarah and some of the children, though the pictures appeared to be several months old. "We have information suggesting that this individual might be in the area," one of the investigators explained. "We're just checking with local residents to see if anyone has seen them." Jake studied the photographs with what he hoped appeared to be genuine interest while his mind raced through possible responses. "Can't say I've seen any of these people," he said finally. "But then, again, I don't get many visitors out here. You might want to check in town, maybe talk to the sheriff." The men asked a few more questions about other ranches in the area and whether Jake had noticed any unusual activity recently. Jake answered honestly where he could and deflected smoothly when necessary, maintaining the demeanor of a helpful but uninformed local resident. After the investigators left, Jake immediately went to find Sarah, who had been watching from an upstairs window with the children hidden in a back bedroom. Her face was pale with terror, confirming Jake's suspicion that these men weren't really insurance investigators. "They're getting close," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to leave tonight. I won't put you in danger because of us." But Jake had already made his decision. "Nobody's leaving," he said firmly. "This is your home now, and nobody's going to force you out of it. We just need to be smarter about security." That evening, Jake made more phone calls to friends and neighbors, letting them know that he might have some trouble with trespassers and asking them to keep an eye out for strangers asking questions. The network of mutual support that existed in rural communities began to quietly activate around Morrison Ranch. Sheriff Tom Bradley, who had known Jake for 20 years, stopped by the next afternoon for what appeared to be a casual visit, but was actually a strategic conversation about property security and the rights of landowners to protect their homes and families from unwanted intrusion. "You know, Jake," the sheriff said as they stood on the front porch watching the children play in the yard, "there's been some talk in town about strangers asking questions. Insurance investigators, they claimed. But something about their story didn't sit right with me." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "I had a couple of men stop by yesterday with the same story. Seemed odd to me too." Sheriff Bradley adjusted his hat and smiled slightly. "Well, you know how it is in small towns. We look out for our neighbors. If you ever have any trouble with trespassers or people who don't belong here, you just give me a call, day or night." The message was clear. The law enforcement in Bear Creek would be on Jake's side if trouble came calling. More importantly, Sarah overheard enough of the conversation to understand that they weren't completely alone in facing whatever dangers David might send their way. As autumn progressed into early winter, the children continued to thrive in their new environment. Marcus had grown several inches and filled out from regular meals and physical work around the ranch. His confidence grew daily as Jake taught him skills like fence repair, animal care, and equipment maintenance. The teenager who had arrived frightened and overwhelmed was becoming a capable young man with a sense of purpose. Lisa took on increasing responsibility for organizing the household and helping with the younger children's education. Margaret Walsh commented frequently on her natural teaching ability and suggested that she might consider education as a career path when she was older. The twins discovered a love of animals and spent every free moment in the barn or pastures, learning to care for horses and cattle under Jake's patient guidance. Their transformation from fearful, withdrawn children to confident young ranchers was remarkable to witness. Sophie's artwork evolved to include detailed drawings of ranch life, horses running free, and families gathered around dinner tables. Her pictures now showed people with genuine smiles and landscapes filled with hope rather than fear. Danny and Emma had completely adopted Jake as a father figure, running to greet him when he came in from work and seeking his approval for everything from their drawings to their choice of clothes. Their trust was complete and innocent, a gift that Jake treasured more than any material possession. Sarah watched these transformations with a mixture of joy and fear. She loved seeing the children flourish, but the better their life became, the more she had to lose if David found them. The investigators' visit had shaken her confidence in their security, and she found herself lying awake at night planning escape routes and contingency plans. But she was also beginning to see something she had never expected: the possibility of a real family, built not on blood or legal obligations, but on choice and love. Jake had proven himself to be exactly what he appeared to be: a good man who kept his word and protected those under his care. The children were thriving in ways they never had before, growing into the people they were meant to be without fear constantly limiting their potential. Winter was coming to Montana, and with it would come new challenges and opportunities. The ranch would be more isolated, but also more protected by weather and distance from the outside world. Sarah found herself hoping, for the first time in years, that they might actually be safe enough to build a real life together. Jake was thinking along similar lines as he watched the family that had unexpectedly filled his empty house with purpose and joy. He had started this journey simply trying to help people in desperate need. But somewhere along the way, these 8 strangers had become his family, and he was prepared to fight anyone who tried to take them away. The stage was set for the next chapter of their story, one that would test all the bonds they had built and prove whether love and determination could triumph over fear and violence. As the first snow began to fall on Morrison Ranch, covering the landscape in pristine white, a sense of both peace and anticipation settled over the household. They had found safety and begun building trust, but their greatest challenges still lay ahead. December brought heavy snow to the Montana mountains, transforming Morrison Ranch into a winter wonderland that seemed to cocoon the extended family in pristine isolation. The children had never experienced a white Christmas, and their excitement was infectious as they helped Jake string lights around the house and barn while Sarah baked cookies that filled the kitchen with the warm scents of cinnamon and vanilla. Margaret Walsh had suspended formal lessons for winter break, but learning continued in different forms. Marcus worked alongside Jake maintaining equipment and caring for livestock in harsh weather conditions, skills that would serve him well regardless of what the future held. The twins built elaborate snow forts and learned to identify animal tracks in the fresh powder. Sophie created snow angels that she decorated with twigs and berries, while Danny and Emma helped Sarah with holiday baking, their small hands carefully measuring ingredients and stirring batter. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to plan for the future rather than just surviving each day. She and Jake had begun discussing the possibility of formally adopting some of the children who had no other family, creating legal bonds that would give them permanent security. The conversations were tentative but filled with hope, 2 adults who had found unexpected family in their middle years. The peace of their winter sanctuary was shattered on December 23rd when Rex began barking frantically in the early morning hours. Jake was immediately alert, years of ranch life having trained him to distinguish between the dog's different warnings. This wasn't the announcement of wildlife or weather. This was the sound Rex made when danger was approaching the house. Jake slipped out of bed and moved to the window, where he could see vehicles approaching through the snow-covered trees. 3 large SUVs were making their way up the ranch road, moving with purpose despite the challenging conditions. His blood ran cold as he realized this wasn't a friendly visit or lost travelers seeking help. Moving quickly but quietly, Jake woke Sarah and implemented the emergency plan they had hoped never to use. While Sarah gathered the children and moved them to the reinforced basement storage room they had prepared for exactly this situation, Jake positioned himself to defend the house while calling for help. Sheriff Bradley answered on the first ring, despite the early hour, confirming Jake's suspicion that the lawman had been expecting trouble. "They're here, Tom," Jake said simply. 3 vehicles, probably 8 to 10 men. "The family is secure, but I'm going to need backup." "Already on my way," Bradley replied. "State police are 20 minutes out. Can you hold until then?" Jake looked at his rifle and the defensive positions he had prepared around his home. "I'll hold as long as I need to." The SUVs stopped just outside the main gate, and Jake could see armed men taking positions around his property. These weren't investigators or local thugs. They moved with military precision and carried equipment that suggested serious firepower. David Mitchell had apparently decided that subtle approaches weren't working and had escalated to direct action. A voice called out through a bullhorn, authoritative and cold. "Morrison, we know they're in there. Send them out, and nobody gets hurt. This doesn't have to involve you." Jake's response was to turn on every exterior light he had and position himself at a second-floor window where he could see the entire yard. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here. Leave now, and we'll call it trespassing. Stay, and it becomes something much more serious." The negotiation that followed was brief and pointless. David's men had come to take Sarah and the children back, and they weren't prepared to accept any answer other than complete compliance. When Jake made it clear that he wouldn't cooperate, they began moving closer to the house, using vehicles and outbuildings for cover. The first shot came from one of the intruders, striking the house near Jake's window but clearly intended as intimidation rather than a killing shot. Jake's return fire was more precise, striking the engine block of the nearest SUV and making it clear that he was prepared to defend his property with deadly force if necessary. What followed was a tense standoff in the pre-dawn darkness, punctuated by occasional gunfire and shouted demands. Jake had the advantage of knowing his property intimately and having prepared defensive positions, but he was vastly outnumbered and couldn't leave his position without exposing the house to assault. In the basement, Sarah held the children close and tried to keep them calm while the sound of gunfire echoed through the house above them. Marcus wanted to help Jake defend the property, but Sarah refused to let him leave the safety of their hiding place. The younger children were terrified but trusted in the adults to protect them, a faith that broke Sarah's heart even as it strengthened her resolve. Sheriff Bradley arrived with 2 deputies just as David's men were preparing to storm the house directly. The lawman's approach was tactically sound, using his knowledge of the property to position his officers where they could catch the intruders in a crossfire. His announcement over his own bullhorn changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "This is Sheriff Bradley of Bear Creek County. You are surrounded and trespassing on private property while engaging in armed assault. Drop your weapons immediately and surrender, or we will respond with appropriate force." The firefight that erupted was brief but intense. David's men were well-trained and heavily armed, but they were operating on unfamiliar ground against people who knew every rock and tree on the property. More importantly, they were in the wrong, both legally and morally, facing opponents who were fighting to protect their home and family. When the dust settled 20 minutes later, 3 of the intruders were dead, 4 were wounded and in custody, and the rest had fled into the mountains where they would eventually be caught by state police roadblocks. Jake had been grazed by a bullet across his left shoulder, but was otherwise unharmed. None of the children had been hurt, though they would all carry the psychological scars of that terrifying morning for years to come. The aftermath brought both relief and new complications. The attack had been repelled, but it confirmed Sarah's worst fears about David's reach and determination. The fact that he had been able to organize a military-style assault on a remote Montana ranch demonstrated resources and connections that went far beyond what she had imagined. Federal agents arrived within hours, drawn by the interstate nature of the crime and the evidence of organized criminal activity. Agent Jennifer Martinez of the FBI became Sarah's primary contact, a woman whose own background in domestic violence cases made her uniquely qualified to understand the complex situation at Morrison Ranch. What happened here goes far beyond a domestic dispute. Agent Martinez explained during her first interview with Sarah. Your husband has been under federal investigation for money laundering and racketeering for over 2 years. This attack gives us the evidence we need to move against him directly. Sarah's testimony, combined with financial records and other evidence the children had inadvertently helped document during their years in David's household, provided the foundation for a comprehensive federal case. But building a prosecution would take time, and David remained at large with resources and motivation to try again. The decision to relocate everyone to a federal safe house was debated for hours. Sarah was terrified of leaving the security of Morrison Ranch, while the children had finally found a place that felt like home. Jake flatly refused to abandon his property or the family he had sworn to protect. These people aren't going anywhere, he told Agent Martinez in no uncertain terms. This is their home, and I'm their family. If you want to catch David Mitchell, you'll do it while keeping us right where we are. The compromise that emerged involved turning Morrison Ranch into a fortress. Federal agents took up residence in nearby locations, electronic surveillance equipment was installed throughout the property, and a communication system was established that could summon immediate help if needed. Jake's house became the center of an invisible but impenetrable security net. Christmas that year was unlike any the family had ever experienced. Despite the terror they had just survived, or perhaps because of it, there was a profound sense of gratitude and unity around the tree Jake and the children had decorated together. The presents were simple, mostly handmade or practical items, but they were given and received with genuine love. Sarah watched Jake opening a drawing that Sophie had made for him, showing the entire family standing together in front of the ranch house with "My Dad Jake," written in careful 7-year-old handwriting. The tough rancher's eyes filled with tears as he hugged the little girl, and Sarah realized that somewhere during their months together, Jake had become more than their protector or benefactor. He had become the father these children had never really had. The children, for their part, had processed their trauma in the resilient way that children do when surrounded by love and security. They understood that bad men had tried to hurt their family, but the bad men had been stopped by good people who cared about them. The lesson they learned wasn't about fear or helplessness, but about the power of adults who keep their promises and fight for the people they love. Marcus had been particularly affected by the attack, not because he was frightened, but because he felt guilty for not being able to help.